Good morning, everybody. That was pretty cool, I thought. So I have three pieces of business before we begin. Cell phones off. I'm told no flash photography. And the New Yorker welcomes you all here today. I thought I'd begin and take you back to 1998, and which was a year when there was no iPod, there was no iPad, there were no smartphones. AOL had 35 million subscribers. They now have 4 million, by the way. And 40% of the people who went online did it through AOL. And back in 1998, Bill Gates and Microsoft were king. They had not yet been sued for antitrust violations. They were on top of the world. They were called the evil empire. And I visited Mr. Gates in 1998 in his Seattle office. And we were talking for a bit, and he reached behind him to get himself a Diet Coke. And of course, like a typical engineer, he didn't think to offer his guest one. I was really thirsty. And I asked him, I said, Mr. Gates, I said, what's your nightmare? What's your business nightmare? What do you worry about most when you think about the future? And I thought he would have said, well, I worry about Netscape, which of course is the browser company that in fact he was sued successfully by the government for antitrust violations for trying to kill Netscape. I thought he might say Oracle. I thought he might say Sun Microsystems. I thought he might say Apple. Instead, he rocked gently back and forth and said, I'll tell you what I worry about. I worry about some guy in a garage inventing something I've never thought about. Well, in 1998, in a Menlo Park garage were two guys, Larry Page and Sergey Brin. And they were inventing something called Google, which in fact has become Microsoft's worst nightmare. If you saw the papers today, on the front page of well, not the front page, but in one of the papers, I think it was the Journal, they talked about how Microsoft is suing Google all over the world to try and prevent them from getting traction, which they already have in the mobile phone business with their Android operating system. And Microsoft is doing to Google today what people, not Google, they didn't exist then, but what companies like Sun Microsystems and others were doing to Microsoft in 98 and 99, suing them for either patent infringement or antitrust violations. And these two guys in the garage, they had a total of 5 people eventually, and then they moved to an office in Palo Alto above a bicycle store. And in 2003, a man by the name of Mel Karmazin, who ran CBS and Viacom then, decided that what is this company, Google, that everyone's talking about? They do this search, and I should maybe go look at it. In fact, he was advised by his investment banker that maybe we should buy Google. So he flies out to San Francisco, drives over to their office. They were then in a smaller office in Mountain View, California. And he walks in and he says, well, show me what you're doing. And he sees this map of all the searches being done all over the world. And he said, that's kind of cool. It's kind of confusing because you see a lot of searches going on in the U.S., but you don't see many lights flashing, say, in Africa and stuff. But you did in Japan and some other places. And he says, so tell me about your system. And he said, well, our system is really simple. You know, it's really cool because it takes about 0.4 of a second to do a search on Google, and we don't try and trap people on our site the way Yahoo does or AOL does, and we just send them to the site or the information they seek, and it's still done through algorithms. And advertising, we have these two advertising programs, AdWords and AdSense, and what you do is you put in, say, in AdWords the keywords you want. If you're Nike, you may put in, you know, I'm interested in selling sneakers, so I'll put in a keyword as basketball. It may be sports, and they'll come up with a series of keywords, and they'll bid on what to pay for every time someone types in that keyword. And let's say Nike bids $1 per keyword. This is them talking to Mel Karmazin, the old media guy. And they said, but then if New Balance sneakers comes along and they have their own keywords and they're bidding for sneakers, let's say 50 cents. What's cool about our system, they tell Karmazin, is that we don't charge the winner, Nike, $1, which is what they bid. We only charge them a penny more than the second bidder. Isn't that really cool? And by the way, let's tell you, Mr. Karmazin, what else is cool about our system. The advertiser doesn't pay unless someone clicks on the ad. And these little ads on the right-hand side, no rich media ads, no 30-second spots. It's just 2 or 3 lines of text, which are really informational, they tell Karmazin, for the people doing searches. And they only pay if someone clicks on the ad. And then when they click on the ad, you may have a direct relationship between the advertiser and the customer, bypassing Google, cutting Google out of that. But in addition to that, you learn, who are these people? Do they like your ad? Do they watch your ad? Do they read your ad? What kind of time are they spending on your site? Isn't that cool? And Karmazin looks at them and says, it's terrible. I don't want that kind of a system. I don't want people to know whether it works or not. I want them to spend $2 million for a 30-second spot in the Super Bowl, which is what people were spending in 2003. And you get 100 million people watching it, and they don't know whether the ad works, whether people watch the ads or not, but they're buying the sizzle. They're buying, the enthusiasm that I am generating and creating for them to sell. In fact, you guys should buy a Super Bowl ad. And they said, why would we buy a Super Bowl ad? We're not interested in that. We're interested in data and knowing more about people, and you don't want to know more about people, do you? And he said, I just want their money, basically. So they went like this for several hours. They went to the dining room where Google gives free meals to all its employees even then. And Karmazin, notorious cost cutter, was kind of surprised by that and probably not enthused. What would that do to my stock price? And at the end of the session, when they were about to part, Karmazin looked at them and said, you guys are effing with the magic. He didn't use the word effing. And I don't either in my book, which is where I tell this story. And they looked at him and kind of puzzled. Switch forward a couple days. Every Friday, Google has a TGIF. Thank God it's Friday at 5 o'clock. And all their employees from all over the world are invited either at the Googleplex to sit in, where they can get 2,000 or 3,000 people in this big hall, or on video screens. And Sergey and Larry generally make a presentation. What happened that week? And they're incredibly candid. I sat in a number of these meetings. I was surprised at how candid they are about deals that are pending, and it never leaks out. It's really quite stunning to me. It would if I were there every week. And in any case, they said, you'll never believe what happened this week. We were visited by this guy, Mel Karmazin, and we showed him around, and he told us about his primitive system of selling ads. And the meeting ended with this guy telling us, you're effing with the magic. And of course, a cheer went up in the Googleplex. And they said, yeah, that's what we want to do. They want to mess with the magic. Well, spin forward. In 2007, I said, I really wanted to take a look at the digital world and the digital wave that was being created by the internet, and how it was affecting traditional media. And who were these guys, as the Redford and Newman movie once asked, when they were being chased by this posse across the Wild West. And so I set out to, what is an interesting company that kind of encapsulates the digital world? And I alighted on Google as a good candidate for that. Tell their story, but also show how they bump up against traditional media, and whether traditional media is trying to ride that wave, digital wave, or is crashing into it. I liken what a journalist often does, particularly when they have time to delve into something, like you do for a book, to visiting other planets. So I set out to visit Planet Google. And let me tell you some of the bigger things in my mind that I think I learned on Planet Google. I learned, and this is why in the book I wrote that came out last November, it was called Googled, the End of the World as We Know It. And the reason I think it is the end of the world as we know it, if you think about Google, you think of Google as a search company. And it's a verb to say I'm going to Google something. You don't say I'm going to search for something. That in itself is extraordinary. But you think about how that world has changed our world. If you're in traditional media, Google is a company that no longer calls itself a search company, by the way. In fact, Eric Schmidt, the CEO of Google, told me that he expects that Google will become the first $100 billion media company. They call themselves a media company. And if you're working for a TV network or a cable network, you are very aware of a company that Google owns called YouTube, where 40% of all the videos that are viewed on the internet are viewed through YouTube. And if people are on YouTube, they are not on NBC or CBS or others. And advertisers increasingly will gravitate to this as an alternate way of doing things. If you look at Google News, which aggregates 25,000 newspapers and magazines from around the world, you may spend less time with the New York Times or with other newspapers. If you look at what Google is doing, digitizing 25 million books ever published in the lawsuit they had, and I'm going to come back to that in this talk, they impact the book publishing business. If you think about Microsoft, Microsoft makes its money largely by selling packaged software, $300, $400, $500 for packaged software. Google comes along and says, hey, why don't you store all of your information and all of your software in our cloud? A cloud is basically a server. And Google has all these data centers all over the world. And when you do, if on my BlackBerry, when I do an email, it's shut off, by the way. But when I do an email, it's basically, the reason I can retrieve it, it's on a server. And that's what Google proposes to do with cloud computing. So instead of spending $300, $400, $500 for packaged software from Microsoft, we'll do it $50, $100. We'll do it much more cheaply for you. And it'll be accessible on any device, in any location, wherever you are. Now, isn't that cool? Well, it scares the hell, obviously, out of Microsoft, as does Google being in the Android business. I saw a figure this morning that Google's Android operating system for its cell phones, which they give away to phone companies, which is why they have a bigger market share today than Apple does. It's an open source, free system, and lots of telephone companies, not just one, as is true in the U.S., AT&T. How many people use AT&T here? You happy? Is anyone happy? One hand. In any case, Microsoft has roughly, I think it's 4% of the operating system for cell phones with their software system. And Android now went from 1% to 17% of all the mobile phones. So some reasons why a company like Microsoft is terrified. I learned something else, which is what an engineer does. And this was really revelatory for me. What I learned about engineers is they start with an attitude that two founders of Google start with, which is that most of the ways the traditional world operates are inefficient, screwed up. And they start with that built-in bias that we can make things more efficient. And in fact, what I learned is that engineers do make things more efficient. If you think of engineers as just data people who massage data, you're thinking of them in the wrong way. Mark Zuckerberg creates Facebook, and I know the movie Social Network is challenging whether he pirated some of that idea, but no one challenges that he's a software and engineering genius. When he does that, or when the Google guys create Google, I would argue that they are more than engineers. They are content creators. Why? Because if you are spending 2 hours of your time on Facebook or 2 hours searching or visiting some of Google's various sites, that is 2 hours you are not spending in a movie theater, with a book, a newspaper, etc. And therefore they are creating content that you are consuming. So I think engineers have helped change our definition of content creation. But what they do is they ask a basic question, I learned. And I would sit in meetings, engineering meetings at Google, and I was quite stunned because I felt like they were speaking Swahili. I mean, they were speaking a language I didn't understand. Maybe I understood 50% of the words they spoke. And I kept on thinking as I'm in this meeting, not understanding half the language. My tape recorder is going, so I could later find out what, get the equivalent of a human dictionary to help me. But I kept on thinking, what was it like when John Scully a marketing guy, ran Apple, when he kicked out Steve Jobs and became the CEO of Apple back in the 80s and the early 90s? What was it like when Terry Semel took over, settled down Yahoo, but then we saw Yahoo technology decline? Again, a movie guy in this case. And I kept on thinking, they had the same problem I did. They didn't understand the language the engineers were speaking. And inevitably, if you're an engineer speaking and your boss needs an interpreter, as I did, as I know they did, then you're going to falter as a company. But I looked across the room, and what did I see? I saw 3 people. I saw the 2 founders of Google, and I saw Eric Schmidt, the CEO. All 3 of them are engineers. All 3 of them didn't need an interpreter. By the way, Steve Jobs is not an engineer, but he doesn't need an interpreter. He knows the lingo. And what I saw these engineers doing repeatedly, not only in these meetings, but in the interviews I would do, they would start with a simple question, 2 words: why not? And the question would be, why not do online newspapers? A newspaper's cost, roughly, this is not true of the New York Times, which has a bigger newsroom than most, but generally speaking, a newspaper, 70% of a newspaper's costs are for paper, printing press, and distribution. Why not eliminate that cost and do everything online, and do it, by the way, so it's instantaneous, and put it out right away? Wouldn't that be cool, and wouldn't that be efficient? Well, it would be. Books. Why not? Same problem. Paper, printing press, distribution, warehousing, huge issues of distribution and warehousing and returns. One of the biggest costs for books is returns. You give the book to the bookstore, but you have to take back the books. And oftentimes you pulp those books, which is another cost. So why not have electronic books? And why not, which they said in 2003, digitize all the world's books? Wouldn't that be cool? And think about it. Books that are out of print are suddenly back in print. You're sitting, instead of going to the library, you can access any book you want whenever you want it. I mean, your knowledge is at your fingertips. And you go down the list. Why not cloud computing? Why not free phone calls? Why not YouTube and any show, any movie you want whenever you want it? And that question, by asking that question, they were obviously challenging. And if you look at Google today, it's a company that is YouTube is not just putting television on, but increasingly is going to be putting movies on. I predict to you I'm going to come back to this, within a couple of years, the major competitor for Netflix will be YouTube. They're going to be downloading movies. The question is going to be, and again, this is a longer discussion that comes later in this talk, how do you get the content? Do you pay for it or do you steal it? And obviously, I think they're going to try and pay for it. That gets very expensive, and you need the cooperation of the people who make movies and television to do that. But moving forward, increasingly, Google was asking questions, why not questions, that put them in businesses, telephone business, advertising business. I mean, think about advertising. Why do you pay 4 or 5% to a media buyer to buy your ads when Google will do it for 1%, let's say, or even less. And not only that, but we'll tell you who is actually watching and charge you only if people click on it, and not charge you the maximum price, but only a penny more than the second highest bidder. Isn't that cool? Well, it's not cool for the traditional advertising agency. So then the question becomes, and this is something else I learned, I had some sense of it going in, but I learned it more acutely by going in. How did traditional media react to this challenge? And in the interviews I did, and I basically spent about half the time interviewing Google people and about half the time interviewing other people. And what I learned is that they all, somewhat usually defensively, would say, well, you know, we had an online newspaper a decade ago, Ken. And that's true, they did. Most newspapers had an online. But as a reporter who covers the media and has for a period of time, I remember those online newspapers. Almost always, not always, I don't want to overgeneralize, but almost always, those online newspapers, the editor of the online newspaper reported to the editor of the print newspaper. The editor of the online newspaper was not allowed to break stories in the online newspaper until they appeared the next morning in the print newspaper. The editor of that online newspaper was, generally speaking, not someone conversant and understanding of the fact that an internet platform is a very different platform than the staid printed newspaper. Because if you think about the difference between an iPad and a Kindle is a unidimensional device. It's a reading device. It's a wonderful device. I have one. I like a Kindle, okay? I like more the iPad. Why? Because the iPad, it paginates, which I really like. I mean, I hate on the Kindle, they say you are now 30% finished with your book, right? As opposed to page 300 or whatever. But also you only see, if you do a newspaper on the Kindle, you only see a story, a single story. If you open up the iPad, you see the entire newspaper. It's in color. And if you're reading an obituary, say, of Ted Kennedy, and you want to watch an interview he did on, say, Charlie Rose Show, you just use your finger and up pops a video. If you want to listen to an NPR interview he did, up pops the audio for that. And if you want to go to the archives and read some things written about his career, maybe sample something of his autobiography or of books written about him, a finger away. That's very different experience, and that's the multimedia world of a digital device. And that was not the multimedia world of most online newspapers. Think about publishers. Publishers were saying, we are providing editing and marketing and all these tools for the author, and we're paying big advances. And the people in the digital world, and increasingly you see Amazon having done this, where they say, hey, wait a second. Why don't you bypass the publisher? Why don't you come to us? Instead of taking a royalty of 15%, which is what generally a hardcover author gets on each book sold, we'll give you 50 or 60 or 70%. Bypass the publisher. We'll become your publisher and do it online. You know that 10% of all books today are sold electronically, 8 to 10%. And they project within the next 3 to 5 years that 35% will. That's a direct threat to the publishing industry. It's also, by the way, a direct threat to bookstores and the way that many of us buy books, which is serendipitously. You walk into a bookstore thinking you buy one book, and you wind up buying several others as well because they just caught your fancy. Something you can't do as well in the online world. But you think about advertising and how they are challenged by this world of actually knowing who your customers are, et cetera. Better example is the music industry. The music industry stayed with a model of you have to buy an entire CD for $15 to $20. We manufacture CDs. You can't, unlike the old days, we don't sell individual records anymore. Remember, you used to have on 45s. And you don't do that anymore. You have to buy the entire CD. Well, along comes Mr. Jobs and iTunes, and suddenly you can buy a single record. You don't have to buy the whole album for 99 cents. And by the way, you want to listen to 25 seconds of the song to be sure you really like it? You can do that too. music industry was obviously incredibly late to understand this threat. So if traditional media was late, the question is why? And one of the things that crystallized for me as I spent time with traditional media companies is I came to feel there were two types of people in the world. There are those who lean forward and see a problem as a challenge, as an opportunity, not a problem, and tend not to blame other people, but say, what can I do proactively to make a go of this? And then there are people who lean back, and those are people who tend to, woe is me, be more pessimistic, see a problem as a problem, not an opportunity, and tend to blame other people. Google is evil. They're doing this to me. Oh, woe is me. And too many people in the traditional media world fell into the lean back category. Secondly, in the traditional media world, the engineer was treated like traditionally engineers were treated. They were on another floor. They didn't report to the CEO. They were not seen as content creators, as they should be seen in the digital world. And so if you went around to the Rupert Murdochs and the Jeff Zuckers and you went to or the Disney people, all the people who run these media companies, including newspapers and magazines and telephone companies, the engineer was not ranked high on the organization chart and did not have a direct relationship with the CEO in most cases. A real mistake if you want to understand the digital world and how to surf that wave rather than crash into it. Third, inevitably, they all face, as any traditional business does, what Clayton Christensen of the Harvard Business School called, in a book about 10 years ago, the innovator's dilemma. And the innovator's dilemma simply is this. Every business that has succeeded for a period of time favors that existing business, which is where most of their revenues and profits and market share comes from. And they see potential threats, people from a garage or elsewhere, coming along, and they have to make a choice. Do they continue to bet and pour resources into the existing business that is the heart of their business? The reason their stock price is ranked relatively high, the reason that their profit look good every quarter? Or do they start diverting money to an upstart that doesn't today generate a lot of profit, but in fact will be the engine for might be the engine for their future growth? It's a guess. It's not even a certainty. And that's the innovator's dilemma that every business faces, not just in the media business. And it's really a tough choice. It's not an easy choice for any business executive or board to make those decisions. But everyone is faced with it. Google is faced with it today. It persists for digital companies as well. Google has to worry about Facebook and about something called vertical search. Will a company like Facebook, I mean, if I do a Google search and I'm looking for a camera, and I say, what about this Sony camera or this Samsung camera, and I get back 10,000 responses, that's totally inefficient of my time. I don't have time to go through 10,000 responses. I did a search once of asked the question in my search box, who was the real William Shakespeare? Well, there's been a controversy over the centuries whether Shakespeare was really Shakespeare. So you can't have one answer to that. You can't even have two answers. But 5 million? That's the number of responses I got. So if you go on Facebook to your friends and you say, I'm thinking about this Sony or this Samsung camera, what do you think? And you get back 10 responses from people you know. That is really a much more efficient search. And by the way, it scares the hell out of Google. And it should. So every company, which is why Google is saying, we really got to get into the social network business. We have a company called Accruit, but it really has not been a success. Despite the vaunted Google image, Accruit has not been a success except in India and Brazil, and even there it's rapidly losing market share. So every company faces this innovative dilemma. One of the things you learn is that it's dangerous to be a middleman. And a middleman is not always who you think of as a middleman. I mean, obviously, a travel agent it potentially is a middleman. You're paying roughly $25 commission to someone to do your travel when you can go to Expedia or some other online site and do it without paying that fee. So, what do you think about a librarian? You can do a Google search. Can you avoid going to the library? Think about the media buying or the advertising agency. Do you need them? Are they a classic middleman? Think about the publisher. I mentioned the example. Do you need a publisher to edit your books when you can get a much larger commission and maybe hire an outside editor for your next book? Newspapers, the news aggregators, or search. You can get all the information you want. Do I need to subscribe? Magazines. Do I need to subscribe? Telephones, why a landline when I have Skype and others, and I can choose that. So everyone has to basically, in any business, ask themselves, what is a service that I can provide that the digital world can't match? For instance, when I fly economy, I still use a travel agent. Why? I'm willing to pay the $25 because they can get me an exit row or a bulkhead seat, which I can't get online. They have the ability to do that. That, for me, is worth $25 on a flight, say, across the country where I want to have leg room and I don't want to go back with my laptop when the person in front of me decides they need a nap. And so, but everyone is faced with this question of, am I a superfluous middleman? In the short run, I think it's undeniably true that a company like Google, and Google in many ways is a surrogate for the Internet, but just staying with Google for a second, I think that Google is wonderful for consumers. It's free. I once had a cable company CEO said to me, how the hell do I compete with Google? He said, they're free, they're quick, everyone loves them, and everyone hates the cable guy. Now, there's a reason we hate the cable guy. But in any case, it's simple. One of the things Google did early on, which is, I think, really important, and how many of you have seen The Social Network, the new movie? It's really a good movie, though I'm troubled by something about it, which I'll digress for 10 seconds to tell you. I'm really troubled when you see fictitious words and scenes put in the mouth attached to real names. It was this fictitious movie, largely. There's some truisms there. But, for instance, Mark Zuckerberg is portrayed as girl-hungry. He's had the same girlfriend since he was at Harvard, and he lives with her today. So, and I'm told he never tried to get into a social club at Harvard. So, I mean, that really bothers me, though it's a brilliant movie. But if you saw that movie, one of the things that Zuckerberg kept saying, and it's true, Facebook, but it's also true about Google, he says it's uncool to have ads or to do certain things on the opening page. You want people to feel like they come first. Google, if you think of Google's home page, that big white page, just a simple search box, just a few words of other Google sites, they were offered in 1999 or 2000 $5 million by Visa. This was a time in 99 and 2000 and into 2001, Google had no revenue. They had no advertising. They literally had no revenue at all. They were living off the money from the two venture capital firms, $25 million, and eating through it. And Visa comes along and says, we'll give you $5 million if you let us put a big ad on your Google homepage. And the VC said, this is great, And the two founders said, it's not cool. We're not going to do it because we have to build the trust of our users. And I think one of the reasons that Google has been successful and other search engines that were there before them did not maintain their lives is because Google was concerned about building your trust as a consumer by doing things like turning down those ads, by doing things like charging, not maximizing the charge they could do for advertisers, by getting you to a site in 0.4 of a second when you do a search and not trying to rope you in and keep you in on one of Google's sites. So they built up trust, and that was real important. And I think Facebook did that. And obviously one of the issues in the future, as you do more advertising, as you want to take more information about who the users of Facebook or Google are, will you undermine that trust? We've already seen examples where Facebook has been compelled to retreat. When they started, Beacon was their first effort, was a program to share information about their users with advertisers. And their users rebelled and said, you can't do that. We didn't give you permission to do it. And they had to retreat. But increasingly, that clash between the user and the business interests of the company and the business interests of the advertiser will become more and more pronounced. And I'll come back to that when we talk a little bit about privacy. So I think in the short run, Google has been a wonderful service and, in fact, a wonderful company full of idealistic people. They don't always live up to the don't be evil motto that they like to attach to themselves. But they are, unlike Microsoft, which I was reporting on in 1998 and wrote a book about in covering the antitrust trial of Microsoft. Microsoft, Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer were cold businessmen. They actually enjoyed destroying Netscape, or trying to destroy Netscape. They lusted to kill Netscape. And if you were in that trial room, as I was, and you read the emails that were presented in the trial, it was like having tape recordings of what these people at Microsoft were thinking. It was incontrovertibly true that they were out to kill or destroy Netscape, which is one of the reasons they were found guilty, not just in the district court, but in the Court of Appeals of unfair practices and monopoly behavior. But Google is different, I think. I don't think they're made up of cold businessmen. I think they're made up of cold engineers. And the distinction is they don't take any joy in weakening the newspaper business or the publishing business or the television business. But they do take joy in doing things more efficiently. And if you're in their way, they see that you're in the way of consumers who want things more efficiently. And by the way, they're right about that. Consumers do want things more cheaply and more efficiently, which is one of the problems the book publishers have. When the book publishers compelled Amazon to raise its price on ebooks, which they did when the iPad came out, and they had the leverage of playing off of Apple against Amazon, which already had gained an 80% market share of all ebooks. It gave the publishers leverage to insist that we control prices, and ebooks, instead of you, Amazon, charging $9.99, you're now going to charge $12 or $13 for an ebook. Well, that helps preserve the publishing industry, but if you're a consumer, you'd much rather spend $9.99. And so inevitably there is a clash between what the consumer wants and what the business both wants and thinks it can afford in order to continue making a profit. And that clash will continue to play out in the years ahead. In the long run, it is not as clear that Google will be as beneficial to consumers as it is today. And let me just cite a couple of reasons why it's unclear. Journalism. Journalism is based on the notion that you have an editor and journalists who have some training, some experience in deciding what is news important, what belongs on the front page, what doesn't belong on the front page. Let me tell you a story about this, which is actually, I love to tell this story, and I should write it one day, but years ago, when the internet was still in its relative infancy, it was 1995, I was moderating a panel, an interview with Andy Grove, who was the CEO and chairman of Intel. We were in Dallas. There were 1,000 newspaper editors in a room like this. And I said, Mr. Grove, and he loves being a devil. I said, Mr. Grove, in the future, what's the value of these 1,000 editors in the room? And he paused for dramatic effect, and he said, 0. I don't need them. I said, why? He said, because I can create my own Andy Grove newspaper with the things I'm interested in. I'm interested in healthcare. I have that pushed to me every day over the internet. I'm interested in business news. I get that pushed to me. I'm interested in sports. I get that pushed to me. I don't need an intelligent agent telling me what I should like, what belongs on my front page or what doesn't belong on my front page. Switch forward 3 years. I'm interviewing Mr. Grove again at another conference. And I quote for him, I said, Mr. Grove, 3 years ago you told me this. Do you still agree with yourself today? And he looked at me and he said, no, I've totally changed my view. I was wrong. I said, why? He said, because I didn't understand the importance of serendipity. That's the word he used. I didn't understand that things would happen in the world that I could not anticipate, but I needed to know about. Rwanda, Serbia, those were all things that were happening in that period of time that I would not have had pushed to me, A. B, there's too much information on the internet. I need an intelligent agent to help sort it out. Well, that's what a journalist does. And an editor and a good publication do. They sort it out, but they do something else. They invest in reporters who spend oftentimes a tremendous amount of time mastering a subject. I was in Afghanistan this spring doing a media story on Afghani media, not on American media. And one of the things that's stunning is if you spend time with New York Times reporters, for instance. I think the best newspaper in the world by far. The New York Times had 4 or 5 reporters in Afghanistan, including Dexter Filkins, who I think pound for pound is the best foreign correspondent in the world. They have probably 20 Afghani stringers who work for them, who speak the language and are plugged in, though everyone, it seems, talks to the Taliban on their cell phone, by the way. I'm always amazed with GPS positioning devices that they're not, drones are not dropping bombs on them. But in any case, and then they live in sheltered communities, guarded communities. The New York Times is probably spending somewhere close to $5 million, give or take $1 million, to protect its resources. No blogger, no online publication is going to be able to match that, nor are they going to be able to match the depth. So you can talk about aggregation, and I don't knock it. I love getting information. I was up at 5 this morning, and I was surfing for information on the web, and I love it. I don't have an attitude of disdain for that. But I do have an attitude of appreciation for good reporting and for how expensive it is. You want to do an investigative report? Oftentimes you may spend 2-3 months on it. And some green eyeshade type guy or someone in the blogosphere who on Huffington Post or Newser or whatever it is saying, wait, we can't, this person's not being productive. This is not efficient. They've only going to write 1 story in 2 or 3 months. We need a daily. We need 2 stories a day. And which is witness, that's what Gannett was famous for. That reporter is not productive because he's just sitting at his desk. Well, sometimes you wait for phone calls to be returned, or sometimes you think about what my lead is going to be, or whatever. But in any case, this is what happens to journalism and whether you can afford to cover state capitals, do investigative reporting, international news, is a real issue. And no search engine that doesn't have an ability to extract or call up that kind of detail, that kind of information, is serving a citizenry that depends on good information to make its decisions in a democracy. But think about copyright. You have one of the reasons that Google decided that they could digitize all the books ever published is because they assumed that it was under fair use. They could do that, which is, in effect, we can extend the copyright and push it out so it's not of concern to us. In my second interview with Sergey Brin, he came in, he rollerblades into his meetings, and he dropped his knapsack on the conference table. We're in a small conference room down the hall from the office he shares with Larry Page. And he said, Ken, before you start asking your questions, let me ask you one. He said, why don't you just publish your book for free on the internet? You get many more readers that way, wouldn't you? I said, well, yeah, I might. I said, well, let me ask you a question, Sergey. I said, who would pay me in advance? I'm on leave from the New Yorker to do this book, so I'm living off an advance that my publishers give me. Who would pay me in advance? He said, oh. I said, let me ask you another question. I said, who would edit the book? Oh. Who would set up a book tour? Oh. Who would pay my expenses? I'm flying out here. I'm staying in a hotel. I'm renting a car. The meals I feel I have to pay for with sources you're interviewing. You don't want them to pay for it, except when you're eating free food at Google Lunch, which was pretty good, by the way. And so how would you do that? Oh. I said, and by the way, who would legally vet the book and all that? By that point, he's ready to change the subject. So what did I learn from that encounter? I learned that he is an innocent. That's one thing I learned. That he doesn't understand the book publishing industry, and why should he? He was then a 34-year-old young man who had lived in a tunnel, that he created, and it was brilliant and very successful. But he didn't know the outside world and the economics and the way a book business functions. Secondly, I learned from that, I think, his attitude about copyright. And his attitude about copyright, which is the attitude that Google search started with. All information should be free. Isn't that cool? Well, it's cool unless you're an author of a book. Or you're a newspaper, and that's your livelihood. That's how you make a living. Or a television producer. How does Martin Scorsese make movies if they're pirated or given away for free? So there is a basic clash between those views. Then you got the question about privacy. And that will become more and more an issue for all of us to wrestle with in the future. Probably less so at a company like Google than a company like Facebook or Twitter, because they have so much more personal information about you on those social network sites. And advertisers just salivate at the thought of gaining access to that information. But it's an issue for Google, and technology is moving such a way that you have an ability for behavioral advertising, basically to read your eyeballs, for instance, and judge what you like and what you don't, what captures your interest, what doesn't capture your interest. And boy, do advertisers love that idea. Because if you think about it, one of the things the digital world allows you to do, instead of spending $100 million, now $3 million on a 30-second Super Bowl ad to reach 110 million people. What if I actually can spend advertising, not in that wholesale way, but in a retail way, just aim it at the people I want? I want people who might buy a Mercedes car. I can actually find out who owns luxury cars in that class, who bought one maybe 2 or 3 or 4 years ago and might be in the market for another one. What an efficient way to advertise. It's a rifle shot aimed at you. But that's a lot of information. Your private information. And do you want to share it? And does government want to allow you to share it? These are all questions that will have to be addressed as we move forward. But I also learned something else. I learned the weakness of engineers. The engineers are good at things they can measure, and with algorithms. They're good at collecting data and parsing it and figuring out, but they're not good at things they can't measure. And if you think about Google, Google was very late, as Microsoft was, for much the same reason, to understand the threat from, say, governments against them. I remember talking to Bill Gates another time, probably in '99, and he was outraged that the government could question his motives, that he wasn't trying to do good at Microsoft. He really believed it, by the way. I don't think he was fibbing. And I think, by the way, Bill Gates today is a different man than the one I was interviewing in '98, '99, the one who was found guilty of antitrust, his company, in 2000. He believed that Microsoft was creating an operating system like a train track, a single train track that everyone could ride over in the world. And that was really cool. It was universal. Why isn't that good, Ken? That's what he's basically saying. Well, what he wasn't talking about was that in order to have that track and protect it, he was knocking off competing train companies. And one of the issues going forward is, will governments allow Google to have the kind of market share they have today, which is 65% in the U.S., 70% in the world? Will governments like China accept, which we know they don't, or Iran or many other authoritarian or worse governments, they don't accept Google's definition of information. They don't believe information is universal. They want to protect and shield their citizens from certain information, which is exactly the problem Google has bumped into in China. China doesn't want its citizens to know about the Dalai Lama or Tiananmen Square when you do a search. And by the way, the same is true in many other countries in the world. For instance, in Germany, and to take a minor example, you are not allowed to publish Nazi information. Mein Kampf is not available in any German bookstore. It's also not available on Google search in Germany, because Google, in that case, respects the local law. In Thailand, you are not allowed to desecrate or criticize the king of Thailand. Google search, any criticism is scrubbed. It's not there. In China, Google resisted what they thought was a much more profound attack on, or a much more profound case of censorship, which it was in China. And now they're trying to work that out. But nevertheless, governments all over the world are raising questions. In Europe, they're much more concerned about privacy issues than we are here. So the European Union is on Microsoft's case about privacy. But privacy, universality of information, market share, these are all issues that people who lack a certain emotional intelligence, which is true of too many engineers and certainly true of the folks at Google or Facebook or Twitter. This is one of the drawbacks that they have and one of the reasons they were blind. By the way, same is true if you think about the lack of emotional intelligence with YouTube. YouTube said, isn't it cool that we can have all this user-generated information and people will, we have this vast audience. Advertisers will love to advertise to reach a vast audience. Well, advertisers didn't love to advertise on YouTube. Why? Because user-generated content is not predictable. It's not considered safe. You don't want your friendly ad placed next to a user-generated content of their dog pooping, right? You want to have predictable programming that you can place your ads next to. So one of the changes, and the engineer didn't understand that, and one of the changes that YouTube is going through, which is why I said earlier, I think they will one day be competing with Netflix. Increasingly, YouTube is starting to buy professional content. And they've already made a deal with several independent movie companies to place their movies and pay for it. But I think increasingly in the months and years ahead, you will see them do more and more of that and try to make deals with TV and movie studios in order to have more professional content. And one of the reasons why YouTube, which last year was projected to lose $500 million, $500 million, that's a lot of money. And only because Google generated profits of $5 billion could they afford to do that, because they were playing a long-term game to build market share. But they've turned that around. And I think by the end of this year, YouTube will be making a small profit. And that's only because they've realized they have to have more professional content. You go on YouTube, you see a lot more professional content or movie trailers or TV clips or whatever. And that's simply in order to attract more advertising. Google has many challenges facing it. They get too big, they move too slow, they lose people. I've already talked about the government challenge. But if you think about a company like Google, I don't think Google, though its stock price is stalled today, I don't think of Google as yesterday's news. If they have success with any one of three ventures that they're pushing, in addition to search, Android with smartphones, there will be 5 billion smartphones or mobile phones in the world by the end of this year. That's more people to do Google searches. So, which they figure out a way to monetize. And if they can figure out a way to sell ads as service or other ways to generate income from Android, that's a huge potential growth industry. Cloud computing I mentioned, is another potential growth industry, particularly for businesses. They go to corporations and say, get rid of your IT department. We'll do it for you. We'll provide you with all the technical assistance you want. We'll store your information on the cloud. We'll save you a lot of money. That's a real potential growth. And obviously YouTube is another potential growth industry for Google. Let me finish up before inviting you to ask any questions you might have. You can make an argument, and I've heard many people say, let me tell you what's going to happen in the future. I think anyone who tells you that should be arrested. I mean that. I don't think the future is predictable. And I've had people, when I go out to the Valley, arrogantly, ahistorical people with no sense of history, tell me, has there ever been a more transformative technology than the Internet? And I look at them like they're crazy, and I say, do you know about Thomas Edison? I mean, how would you have a computer? How would you have an Internet? How would you have television or air conditioning or manufacturing without electricity? I haven't even mentioned Mr. Gutenberg. That's not to depreciate the impact and the transformation that the Internet has brought. It's just to put things in perspective. But I think what is also worthy of being put in perspective, and what is different about the era we live in today, is the velocity of change. Never before have we lived in a period where things change so rapidly and change and upend all of our lives. Just think about it. I mentioned what didn't exist in 1998. Well, it took the telephone 70 years, 7 decades, to reach 50% of the American people. It took electricity 5 decades to reach 50% of the American people. It took television a little over 3 decades to reach 50% of the American people. It took the Internet 9 years. It took Facebook 5 years to reach 550 million users. The speed of change. So if you're sitting in a business, I don't care what your business is, if you're not scared, there's something wrong with you. Of course, you should be scared. And when you spend time with executives, traditional media company executives, and you go back for that second and third interview, as I've done, you scratch that surface and they're scared. And it's healthy to be scared, as long as they're leaning forward, not leaning back. As long as they're seeing it as an opportunity, not a problem. And I'll leave you with the final word. Before I ask anyone who has questions, there's going to be microphones on either side, and because we're filming this, we need to, or videoing this, we need you to step up and ask your question at the microphone. But Albert Camus was a great writer and a great resistance fighter in World War II. And despite all the reasons he was arrested, he was in a prisoner of war camp, despite all the reasons he had to be pessimistic, he once wrote something that stays with me, and I hope it stays with you. He wrote, "A good hope is better than a bad holding." Not a bad way to end. Thank you. Microphones here. Would you identify yourselves too, so that we have a posterity?
The whole name?
Whatever makes you happy.
I'm Doris Fuller from Washington, D.C., and I love Google. I run a Google AdWords account. I have Google Voice. I have Google Alerts. I have Google Sync. I Google. And sometimes as a consumer, it's a little scary. Like, what happens if Google collapses, or just as I feel exposed to all my Googling. What, as a consumer, should we be concerned about?
Well, Google doesn't know your name, but they know everything you've done. They have a cookie that's attached to you, and they know the searches you've done, which is one of the reasons they can, when they guess what you're searching for. When I put in jobs, they know that I've done searches for Steve Jobs, so they don't say, do you mean employment of Steve Jobs? They just say Steve Jobs, because I've done enough searches on that. So they know my behavior on that. But Google Maps, they know things you've done. They know what you read, what you purchased. So there's a fair amount of information. So will that information be shared with an advertiser? And that's maybe of concern to you. It certainly is to me. And I don't want to share an advertiser. But increasingly, particularly if Google doesn't have success growing in some of these other businesses, the financial pressure for growth will become greater, and the pressure for them to turn over information, and for not just Google, all these companies will become greater. And you want to have people you want two things. You want people who have a value system that says, I believe in certain privacy, even though privacy, clearly the definition of privacy is changed. You just look at Facebook and how much information people are willingly sharing. On the other hand, what is the role of government? Does government can step in and protect us in some way from that? And I think those things are on the table now.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Yes, I'm Jane Warshaw, Mr. Auletta. Question is, are you saying that new writers then should go with the old way of finding an agent and a publisher as opposed to self-publishing or publishing through
I think that I don't believe there's any one answer to that question. No, I'm not saying that. I think that there'll be some writers who will figure out a way to directly publish, skip the publishing industry, treat the publishing industry as a classic middleman, superfluous. And there'll be others who will say, I need that editor. I need that book tour. I need that advance to live on. I can't do this on spec. And I need the support of a house, and I need bookstores. See, that's a really, I didn't talk much about that, but that's a real issue. There are now 1,400 bookstores left in the United States. And publishers need bookstores because the serendipitous purchase I mentioned before. How does a bookstore compete with an electronic book? You go online to Amazon or the iPad or iBooks, or you go to Google, which is going to be by the end of the year supposed to have its own electronic version, or Barnes and Noble's Nook, and you buy a book for $12. That bookstore doesn't have an electronic equivalent, so it has to sell you that same book for $25, let's say. And how do they compete with that? And they have overhead costs that the electronic doesn't. So I'd like to keep bookstores in business. And actually, one of the things Google's doing, to their credit, they're going to have, as part of their electronic book publishing, they're going to allow bookstores to sell books off their websites. So you can go into bookstores and actually buy that electronic book, if that's what you choose to do, through the bookstore, and they will get a commission on that from Google.
You can buy either a hardcover or you can buy.
Yes.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I like the old book.
Well, I do too, but when I travel, I like my electronic book, and but I can't put them on my library shelf. And when I'm writing something, say, what was that thing? Yeah. I like to be able to look and say, oh, wait a second, there's a story in there I could use.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes.
You mentioned using an iPad and using a BlackBerry. Do you have a Droid? And if you have all three, how do you differentiate your use of the three devices?
I don't have a Droid. I have a BlackBerry, which I hate. I hate because I hate their browser. Surfing the internet on a BlackBerry is a pain in the butt. But what I like about it, which one of the reasons I don't have an iPhone, I need a keyboard. In fact, I don't even give out my cell phone number. My family has it, but I don't really give it out. I use it for email, and that connects me. And when someone wants to contact me, I say, just email me. I'm kind of like Larry Page, with my head down all the time. But the truth is, I'm going to look at the new Motorola with the keyboard. But I need a keyboard. But I don't. The iPad I use for mostly reading. I don't use it for email and stuff.
Okay. Thank you.
My name is Michael Cole, and I have a computer consulting company called Magic Computer Consulting. Thank you very much for a very comprehensive and concisely framed presentation of the technologies and strategies of Google. And I wondered if you had a moment to comment about the international controversy regarding Google Street Views and what your speculation would be of why you think the United States has so far abstained from presenting any kind of discussion or confrontation with Google.
I think the United States has confrontation with Google on other issues, including market share and copyright. As you know, I mean, there's a court case pending on with the publishers whether the judge will approve the settlement that the publishers and Google agreed to. By the way, I should have mentioned, it's a very significant thing that happened, and one of the reasons why there's possibility to be optimistic about the merging of old media and new and serving each other's interests is that Google agreed to pay as part of that publishing settlement. They agreed that the publishers were right, that there is a copyright issue involved, that all information should not be free, and that their definition of fair use was too broad and had to be narrowed. They agreed to pay publishers and authors $125 million. That's a lot of money. So a digital company was acknowledging that you have to pay for content. And which exactly, if you think about Apple, what are the apps and what is iTunes but an agreement that you pay for content? So increasingly what we're seeing in the world, which is really, I'll come to your Street View question, what we're seeing in the world is that the YouTubes of this world, the Apples of this world, know that they need professional content in order to get people to be on their devices, right? At the same time, the traditional media world knows that advertising is a very thin reed, as the new world has learned that advertising is a very thin reed. Recession taught everyone that. And we want to get paid for our content, says the New York Times, says the publishing world, says the TV world. Well, increasingly, the digital platforms are moving closer to the traditional media companies that produce the content. That's a very hopeful and significant thing. I should have mentioned earlier. But to your question about Street View, I think there are two answers to that. The U.S. government has a lot on its plate regarding Google. Secondly, I think we are less concerned about privacy here than they are, say, in Germany, which triggered that issue. And here is a lot of feeling that Street View is pretty cool. It is pretty cool. But by the way, it is pretty shocking the amount of stuff you can find through Street View about people, where people live and what their house is like, and street traffic and seeing things. So I think it's a real privacy issue at some point. And I think what happens, this is another example of the brilliance of the engineer whose virtue, and who thinks it's a virtue to collect as much data as he or she can. But in the real world, some of that data we want to keep off limits because we think it violates our privacy. So the data miners at Google that love collecting Street View data and search data and all this data confront or then bump into the reality that people say, hey, wait a second, you're violating my privacy. Who gave you permission to do that? And that, again, will be an issue that will increasingly come to the fore, not just for Google in the future and Street View, but for Facebook and Twitter and a lot of other digital companies. One of the interesting battles that's going on, for instance, is in the iPad and Apple with magazines or books. Who owns the customer? Who keeps the information? Does Apple share it with publishers and magazines, or do they keep it? Normally, when you sell a subscription to the New Yorker, you get the data. You know, who the name of the person, their credit card, oftentimes. You know, what they like, what they don't like, whatever. And now that's a real battle royal that's taking place between all these digital platforms and traditional publishing, and be interesting to watch it play out.
Thank you. I just for a moment, I should have been more specific. I wasn't referring to the graphic or geographical data about Street View, but the associated data that Google was collecting from regarding personal wireless networks that France and Germany and other countries have gone after them for retrieval of, for personal information that was retained and discovered by Google.
Well, I think, again, the same answer applies. I mean, it's a really, it's an emerging issue that I think we'll see more of about. The Wall Street Journal did a terrific series of pieces in the last 2 months about privacy and raising some of these issues, and it's really salient.
Thank you.
Hi, like the first questioner, I use Google on an alarmingly high number of aspects of my life, and I know that cloud computing makes it possible in some ways, but I'm a little bit alarmed. I don't know enough about cloud computing and the security of it, and even I work in a school now, and the school's adopted Google Apps to store information online. But what kind of safeguards are there about the security of cloud computing and all the information that Google is storing for us online on their servers?
We don't know a precise answer to that question. What we know is this, that Google's success is built on trust. One of the reasons that Google reacted so strongly to Chinese censorship, if you remember last December, it was revealed that in China, someone was hacking into Gmail accounts and Google's basic software. And presumably with the support, encouragement, or maybe the active connivance of the Chinese government. The reason that Google pulled out, they pulled out for two reasons, I think, initially. One is Sergey Brin increasingly was uncomfortable, and he was a refugee from the former Soviet Union. His family fled as Jews. They felt discriminated against. They came here, built a life, academic mother and dad, and he's always had a passionate feeling about human rights and hated the fact that he swallowed hard and compromised with the original search in China in 2005, 2006. But so he was always uncomfortable and he pushed it. But what triggered the push was not just his passion about that, but what happened with their hacking into the software. Because really what that said is that you can't trust Google because it can be broken into. And as a business proposition, that's devastating for Google and devastating for the whole notion of cloud computing. One of the reasons why I'm wary of cloud computing, for instance, is I want to control my information. What if the broadband goes down? How do I access my stuff? I'm writing. I'm really dead, and it does go down from time to time, as we've seen. So, so that would be their honest answer. They probably wouldn't say it the way I did, but I think that they say we have an incentive to protect that information because if we don't, you're going to abandon us. But are there government controls? No. And should we be wary about government controls? Yeah. I mean, you gotta. This world is moving so fast that you regulate yesterday's problem. So, but it's of concern. And government at least has to be asking questions and looking over his shoulder and saying, "Hey, are you protecting this?"
Hi, my name's Jonathan. I work in digital advertising. There's ongoing conversations about how much advertising dollars go towards the internet, and newspaper and television continue to get a disproportionate spend relative to the amount of time that we all spend with them. So it sounds like your friend at CBS is kind of hanging on with these fingernails. When do you think that shift will change? And based on the conversations that you have with the likes of Google and so forth, where we'll start to see investment being made in digital advertising relative to traditional analog media?
If you look at newspaper advertising, just several years ago, $50 billion was spent on newspaper advertising. Today, less than $30 billion is spent on newspaper advertising. So it's a shrinking market. And a lot of that money is going to Google's and digital, or going to some other way because it's deemed to be not as efficient to spend your advertising that way. There's an argument that people in the digital sales world make that there's $40 billion out there that if it followed where people are actually spending their time, it would go to the digital world and away from the analog world. And that's the number, the target number that I've heard from these people. And I have never met a traditional media person who wasn't scared, and scared of that, as well as of technology, as well as the uncertainty of what's next. And clearly there is a real danger that it's just going to be tip over the side of the cliff. And in many ways, it's already happened to newspapers. I mean, it's a pretty shocking thing when newspaper advertising is almost half of what it was just several years ago. That's pretty stunning. And it's declining for television and radio and others, and it's a real problem. I mean, you think about all the people that sit there and worry that am I a stationary target? How'd you like to own a movie theater? I mean, most of us have big screens at home, and the popcorn is better in our house and less expensive. And so if you're in a movie theater, you say, hey, what am I doing? And by the way, look what happened to Blockbuster. Look at how fast Netflix, to their credit, has moved to shift from a DVD model, which DVDs are dying, to a download movie model. You've got to move faster. It's happening. But clearly there is going to happen. I don't know whether it happens next year or 5 years from now. But sometime soon, more advertising will flee and go to digital. If, however, I'm in traditional analog business, and I shift my business model effectively to a digital model, then I reap the benefits of that digital. I mean, if in fact the New York Times is successful with their online newspaper, if they can create a paywall the way the Wall Street Journal or the FT have successfully and charge subscribers for an online newspaper, that's fabulous. And it assures the continued health of great journalistic institutions. The problem is that the Wall Street Journal and the FT have an audience that oftentimes will write it off as a business expense, their subscription. The Times doesn't have that same audience. And the other problem is that advertisers know, and this gets to the heart of your question, the average reader of the New York Times online spends 34 minutes, I think it's 34 minutes on the New York Times. The average reader of the New York Times spends 35 minutes on the New York Times. Here's the difference. The average reader of the New York Times newspaper spends 35 minutes a day. The average reader of the New York Times online spends 34 minutes a month. So the advertiser says, I'm not going to pay the same amount for my ad online as I pay for it in the newspaper. Roughly, they're paying 10% of the cost. So if I save the production costs and the printing costs and the distribution costs, I'm saving money there. But am I making enough money selling ads at 10% discounts because the advertiser knows that people are not reading the same way online and not noticing my ads in the same way? And that's a crunch question.
Hi, Ken. I'm Aaron.
Hi, Aaron.
A question for you. Actually, I'm hoping for some conjecture. I'm a fan of the author Jürgen Habermas. And Habermas is famous for writing a book called The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere. And in that book, he talked about essentially the invention of the printing press, and then tea houses and salons in France and discussion groups around the age of the Enlightenment. And I'm curious, because we're going through a similar structural transformation of the public sphere, and what do you think that means for the culture that's growing around this transformation? What's the age that we're entering into, and what does it mean for all of us?
You like simple questions, don't you?
I was going to ask you what the answer to the innovator's dilemma was, but
there is none. There is no answer to that. There's no, one of the things you increasingly, I don't think this is just true of the world I cover of media, it's true for a parent. There's no rule book. We're all guessing our way how to handle certain things, an unruly teenager or a boisterous Google coming along as a competitor. You just, trial and error, trying things, and again, leaning forward and thinking of opportunities. But your broader question, and it's really a broad and important question, the culture is different. I tend to be an optimist. I see problems with the internet. I see problems with instant information. I see problems with deciding what news to run based on algorithms, because if you base your news on algorithms, you're going to have too much Paris Hilton for my taste, right? I actually believe that journalism, say, is a profession, and therefore should be empowered to tell you what they think is important. And you either read the paper or don't. But I like that. I believe in that. So in that sense, I'm old-fashioned, if you will, and willingly plead guilty to that. On the other hand, I do worry. I worry about attention span. I have never talked to a teacher or rarely spoken to a teacher who has not expressed concern about the impact of the internet on how their kids read and behave, or taking electronic devices into classrooms and not paying attention to the college professor. These are all issues that I think are worrisome. I think that my own belief is that if you want to multitask, you are not, music is one thing, but if you're going to be reading a book and doing instant messaging and watching television, I don't believe you're concentrating, certainly not on the kind of book you talked about. And I have a 14-year-old, 15-year-old nephew who did a paper and he got an A on it, and it's on it's a history paper. And I said, James, how did you do the research for it? And he said, well, Uncle Ken, I Wikipedia. I got the information from Wikipedia. I said, James, you didn't just copy the information from Wikipedia. He said, no. He said, in fact, in schools, there are a couple of websites where schools subscribe to, and they scan papers that are delivered, and they tell you whether it's plagiarized or not. That's cool. I didn't know about that. That was kind of cool. On the other hand, when my nephew is going to Wikipedia or doing a Google search for a paper that he got an A on, he is not delving into a book, not doing the kind of immersive research that you want students to do. So I worry about the impact, and I worry about the impact on reading. I am terribly frightened when I think about the future, and I'm talking about 20 years from now. Will publishers be able to give an advance for a book like you described, which I don't know, by the way, that book, but I'm going to take the name down and check it out. But will publishers be able to pay in advance to support an author who wants to write a serious book that doesn't threaten probably to be a bestseller, but is very important for our culture, to have exposure to that? And the same is going to be true in movies. In many ways it is true, because too many movies are Spider-Man 1, 2, and 3, and the Iron Man 1, 2, and 3, and things that are seen as big opening blockbuster movies. And it's sometimes very hard for that independent, smart movie to be produced. And the Facebook movie, Social Network, as it's called, is a rarity. It's a movie about something. And so increasingly I think there's reason to worry about our culture. But if you ask me, so are you an optimist or a pessimist, Ken? I would tell you I could not get up every morning being a pessimist. I don't want to live my life, biting my nails and fearful of what's going to happen. I want to lean forward, and I want to think more positively. But at the same time, I'm a journalist, and I can keep two or more thoughts in my mind at the same time, as Scott Fitzgerald once said, and still function. And I see the negatives. Thank you. I think we'll take one more question after this one.
Hi, Ken. My name's Stephen Morrow. I'm from Northern Ireland. You really talked today about the content being king, and it was really fascinating. I just wondered, do you see, we and Google understands very little about the content actually today. Do you see it being a real game changer when they can actually understand content? So to take your example of the YouTube video where the dog's pooing, to know automatically that dog is pooing and to match that, do you just see that as being as a next big thing?
I think there are. My book was purchased for the movies, the way the Social Network was, and whether it's made or not, I don't know, and I have nothing to do with it. I just don't want to be involved. They pay you a relatively modest amount. If the movie's made, you get more. But I agreed to one conversation with the producer is the guy who did Milk, the movie Milk. So it's one of the reasons it was a serious movie and I liked it. And he said, well, what's the conflict? And I said, you could say the conflict in the Google story is how they started it and the battles they had with venture capitalists, with other search engines, with Microsoft. That's one. Or you can say the conflict is old media versus new. But I think the more interesting conflict, and it directly relates to your question, is two young and pretty idealistic young men come into the world, and suddenly they're confronted with reality. The reality of book publishers saying all information is not free, or newspaper editors or magazine editors saying, what about copyright? Or some of you asking questions about privacy. Or government saying, wait a second, we believe in regulation because we have to protect the common good or the public interest. So suddenly they are confronted by the reality of the real world. I mean, the story I told about Sergey Brin saying to me, why don't you publish your book for free online? I think the answer I gave him was kind of startling to him because it was really exposing him to a world that he was not exposed to. And just as when they fought the publishers and then relented and agreed, they agreed because they realized they had to make compromises. And I think that's the interesting dynamic that's going on there, and how that plays out in the future and how fast they're able to change. But I think that's going to be true of Mark Zuckerberg and Twitter. I mean, Twitter has to figure out, I mean, a very popular service, right? They lose money. How do they make money? How do smartphones make money? How do advertisers advertise on smartphone? Excuse me, can we interrupt your phone conversation to bring you this in? I don't think so. It's not going to work. So they have real issues, real world issues. They're really going to be fun to watch. It'll be fun for people like me who don't have responsibility for anything but words, So anyway, thank you all.